His research has taken him to cities all over the world, especially cities where political and economic crisis have endangered and, in a way, empowered youth. I'd like to note sometimes the courses that academic colleagues teach. It gives us a sense of how they're relating our own academic research to what we're doing with people actively in terms of training. A key part of Professor Aitken's training function is training doctoral students. There's at least one former PhD under Stuart here today. But he teaches courses entitled People, Places, and Environments, Qualitative Methods in Geographic Research, and very relevant for this topic and for this setting here at UW-Tacoma, Community-Based Geographic Research. Here is Professor Stuart Aitken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JW. Good morning, how are you? Can you hear me with the lapel mic? Great, good. It's very good to be here. What a hard act to follow. Oh my goodness, I'm so intimidated. Thank you so much for, and I'm sorry, I guess you had, some of your colleagues had to go to class or something, but it's wonderful to be here. I don't know, I'm not going to be able to say anything better than what they said in the first hour. Maybe what I'll try and do is contextualize from an academic perspective what they did. I never know what I'm going to say before I get up here. I have a bunch of slides, so we'll see how it goes. And with that reminder to myself, I'm going to set my timer. It's very nice to be here. I've been in San Diego now for about 30 years, but as you probably can gather, I'm not originally from San Diego. Let me just set this thing going. There we go. And I'm from Paisley in Scotland, and even although I've been in San Diego for a long time, it always feels like I'm coming home when I come to these northern latitudes, and I don't even mind the rain and the dreich weather. It really is nice to be here. And Paisley is an industrial town, also a weaving town. When I was growing up in the city of the town of Paisley, we had two operating textile mills, both of which are gone. Male unemployment was 60%, alcoholism was rife. I grew up in that kind of environment. And so I also feel at home when I come into these industrial, refurbished and reused certainly, but these industrial settings. It's really, really quite nice. So thank you very much, JW, for the introduction. That was very generous. I wish my mum was still here to hear that. That was a good one. And what I'd like to do is begin with a story, because I'm a geographer, and some of you may be wondering how a geographer gets involved studying children. And there's a couple of stories I could tell you, but I thought I'd go back to the 1980s and a trip that I made down to Mexico. This is Mexico City. And how many people have been to Mexico City before? You know, one of the largest cities in the world. And it's a boisterous city. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. And in the center of the city is the Zocalo. And here's an aerial photograph of it showing the old Spanish cathedral in the Constitution Plaza. And to the right, here's the Spanish cathedral. And to the right-hand side, there's Tenochtitlan. How am I pronouncing that? Tenochtitlan, is that good? The old pyramid, the Aztec pyramid? Okay. We Scotsons can say that quite well. So I'm wandering around there. This is 1986. This is after that big earthquake that they had there. And I'm wandering around, and in the middle, in between Tenochtitlan and the Spanish cathedral, and the Spaniards took the stones from the Aztec pyramid to build the cathedral. And so we see the demise of this amazing empire at this time with Cortés and the creation of a new imperial domain. And I think you'll know where I'm going with this when I say there's the adult world. And in between these two edifices of our failures, we had the children of the Zocalo. And these young people were busking right in the center, and they were creating a cacophony. It was a noise, it was discordant notes, and it's a busy place for those of you who have been there, right? And people were kind of wandering around the outside, you know. And so we have the guy in the trumpet, we have the bass drum, we have the snare drum, and we have a young infant with a bowl collecting money. I lost the original slide of this. This actually became the cover of my book in 1994, which is the first book I wrote on children. But I was so taken by these young people. And they're sitting there, and they're part of the informal economy, so they're part of who we are. But they're independent, and they're creating noise, and they're creating disturbance. And a lot of adults are not paying too much attention to them. But some are. Some are sitting and trying to figure out what they're doing. And maybe we shouldn't be figuring out what young people are doing. Maybe we should be accepting who they are and what they are and their relations, as we heard about, the relations that we have with them. But this really affected me, that these young people were resilient, were empowered in some way in between these two edifices, these two imperial edifices of our adult failures. So that was a story that got me started thinking about young people. And so what I want to do with you in the time I have today is talk about three things. First of all, understanding young peoples in urban space. And let me first of all say that understanding is a hugely problematic word. Maybe accepting would be better. I use the term understanding because I want to talk about how academics haven't done too well in trying to understand young people. Up to now and even now. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about child-friendly cities and very briefly about some of the work that the UN has done with that since 2000. And then I'm going to try and offer you my take on sustainability and sustainable urban places with young people as central to that concept of sustainability. Okay, so let's think a little bit about how academics haven't really done so well in this. And unfortunately, to the degree that you practitioners listen to theoreticians like me, you're culpable as well. So let's go back to, let's keep it in the North American context, and going back to the 19th century. And this is kind of my take on the story. Many of you in urban planning will have different stories about how children and young people became part of our understanding of how cities and young people work. But for me, Jacob Riis was one of the first. And he was a Dutch immigrant, came to New York City in 1870, and 20 years later, he wrote the famous book, How the Other Half Lives. And this book used technology, the technology of photography, to take photographs, not just of young people, but a lot of young people, young immigrants in their settings of squalor and degradation. And the technology enabled Riis to talk a little bit about how maybe we should make our cities, New York City in this particular context, better for these young people. And so, for example, Belmont Bend became a park in 1895 for young people and started the city fathers of New York, and I use fathers with intent here, thinking a little bit about Mulberry Bend Park, thinking a little bit about how to change the city to accommodate and change these young people. Okay? And today we see that as a little bit problematic, and clearly we wouldn't be doing that kind of thing now. But Riis used the technology to suggest that we can change these young people. This is 5 Points House of Industry. The term it's an orphanage, but the term is quite interesting. And his argument was we would take these, a lot of Irish, Polish, Eastern European young people away from their parents and put them into foster care. And he used the technology of photography and slideshows to impress upon reformers of the time, social reformers who were at that time middle-class white people, that if we take these children away from their environments, take them away from their communities, okay, so bouncing off what was said today, we can see, years and years later that this might be a little bit of a problematic thing to do. Put them in orphanages, and change them, you know. And this is them at the House of Industry at Prayer, clearly changed young men in this particular example. So Jacob Riis went on taking his photography, and about 15 years later, the Playground Association of America was started in 1906. This is a picture from Jacob Riis's biography, and this is him wandering around looking at the degradation. And behind him is the New York City's police commissioner of that time, Teddy Roosevelt, who became the first president of the Playground Association of America. So there was powerful people, powerful men involved in this kind of thing. And we all know Teddy Roosevelt was very about getting people out, getting them into nature, physical activity, and so forth. Now, the academic who was involved with the Playground Association of America was G. Stanley Hall. And he was the man who popularized the term adolescence as a term for understanding a particular brand of young person. And G. Stanley Hall, he was a theoretician, and so, you know, be wary of theoreticians. Be wary of what I'm saying right now, because I'm a bit of a theoretician as well. He was a neo-Lamarckian, so he was following Darwin's evolutionary theory, and he brought up these ideas called recapitulation. And his idea was this: the recapitulation idea that Hall was arguing for was that in our lifetimes, we will recapitulate the evolution of mankind. And again, I'm using mankind ironically here. So little babies in their sandboxes or in the ooze and the mud, right? And then as they become teenagers and adolescents, and this is what G. Stanley Hall was about, that's them in the tribal phase. And then they become developed and superior, like what we as adults become, okay? And his argument was then we get those kids when they're in their tribal stage and we take them away from Mullins Alley and the gang in Mullins Alley. We take them away from their playground on the street where all they know how to do is to steal apples from apple carts. And we form them into what we want them to be. Now, this is a notion that goes way back to the Enlightenment. This goes back to Jacques Rousseau, who talked about children as a tabula rasa, upon which you and I, as the adults who apparently know better, write our culture onto them. And that's exactly what G. Stanley Hall was arguing. And there was other important people here. John Harvey Kellogg at that time, again, for physical education. Teddy Roosevelt was also about this. So all these things are coming together to try and create a particular urban environment for these young, unfortunate, disaffected youth in their impoverished immigrant ghettos. And the idea was to create these parks. And through the years, we get the City Beautiful movement, and you know, and we get. You have a park here that's from that as well. We have Balboa Park down in San Diego. But at the time, as well as the parks and the spaces and the nature for children to be in, were the programs that they were to be part of. And the Playground Association of America was very intent upon creating particular kinds of programs that would then create the kind of adults that they wanted these young people to become. And these programs were focused on very gender-biased kinds of contexts. So the young girls would learn how to sing patriotic songs and sew clothes and learn about what later became home economics and the science. And the boys would learn competition, but in team sports and so forth. And the timing prior to the Great War and prior to a context of nationalism and learning to be patriotic and learning to fight and learning to work in a team is not lost on some of the scholars who are studying the particular philosophies and theories that were at work in the Playground Association at that time. A little bit later, you might recognize the gentleman there, moving over to Europe, that's Sigmund Freud. It's okay, I'm not going to talk Freudian theory, but I am going to talk about the woman on his arm, his daughter, Anna Freud. And Anna Freud and Melanie Klein together created the context, the beginnings of child psychology, understanding kids' minds as we know it today. And I'm not going to get into that too much just now. But let me just focus on Melanie Klein, who pushed away from Freudian theories to talk about something that these young people were talking about today. She was what's called an object relations theorist. She started this thing called object relations theory, where the context of understanding young people, and as adults as well, is our relations. Our relationships to the non-material, to objects, to the material, to relations with other people. She was very intent upon that. And she argued, and later object relations theorists like Donald Winnicott argued, that what we need to do, and this was what we heard earlier on this morning, what we need to do is create a safe space for all of us to engage in appropriate kinds of relations. And so she talked about, like, this has come across a little bit like an aura, but like a potential space. The word they used was a potential space, a safe space for young people to discover their relations with others and thereby understanding who they were themselves and being able to create and recreate those relations, and so that they could create and recreate themselves. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the talk. Staying with Europe, and then, those of you in education will remember Piaget, Jean Piaget, the French educationist, many nods in the back there. And all of a sudden, we're moving away from relations now, and we're looking at the child as an individual who learns about space, and there's a particular path to progress, so that younger children, when you get them to draw sketch maps of their community, will draw symbolic houses and so forth. And as they get older, they get planar views, and then they get more abstract as they grow older. But it's all about the individual learn. And I'm not maligning this work. It still continues today in experimental psychology and developmental psychology. But it's a very specific way of knowing the child as an individual and what the child takes on in space. And then you end up getting some horrendous things. And like these kind of models. This is what us academics do with our time, right? This is Roger Hart and Gary Moore's work back in the 1970s, where they take these stages and they then try and figure out what children should be doing at particular stages. And as our panelists said this morning, and as we know now, children are way smarter than we academics and we adults think they are. And to the degree that scientists put children in these stages and create a statistic that suggests it's significant, there's always others that are not considered. And there's always a continuum that blows this structure out of the water. I don't want to say anything more about that right now. One of the most influential people writing at this time for me was Bill Bungay, and he did what was called geographical expeditions. He got out into the field with young people, and he started looking at the context of young people. And he gathered data about young people in cities, and this hadn't been done in the 1960s. He was working in Detroit at the time, and this was novel kind of data. He and his students went and walked around downtown Detroit in the middle of the summer and counted the number of houses that didn't have screens on the windows or the door, and he created a map called Fly-Covered Baby Regions. Okay. He was a polemicist, right? He wanted to create a particular stir. Or regions that had fewer doctors for the health of young people, which he called doctorless regions. And this was one of his famous maps that got taken up by the news at the time, where he went in and counted the infant mortality in the counties in Detroit and compared them to developing world figures. And what we see is that in the downtown of Detroit, it's like being in a third world country. And in the periphery, we begin to see the kinds of infant mortality rates that we would prefer to have in an American city. And he created a model talking about, again, in his stylish rhetoric, the city of death for young people and the machine spaces that killed young people on the streets in downtown Detroit. And then he talked about the suburban. Now, we might flip this today because our downtowns have really come back since that. But in the 1970s, for those of you old enough to remember the downtowns then, there was so much blight and degradation, and particularly in cities like Detroit. And then those houses were owned by the landlords who lived in their affluent communities in the city of superfluity in the periphery of Detroit. So that was very influential. This too was kind of interesting. Bungay moved to Toronto, and he worked with some young people in a neighborhood to the west of Toronto on Bloor Street. And, oh my goodness, I'm going through this too fast. Here we go. This street here on the wallpaper is in a place called the Annex, a neighborhood called the Annex, west of downtown Toronto, where children actually play in the street. And he got a young girl, 9 years old, single parent mother, to draw a mental map of her neighborhood. And he got what Piaget would said was a fairly good mental map of someone who was well adjusted to the environment, who knew her central area pretty well. As they moved away from the home, she lost a little bit of her understanding of details and so forth. And then, and I took this photograph when I was in Toronto in the 1980s. If I turn my camera right round like this, I get a picture of a high-rise development. And Bungie went and questioned a young girl in the high-rise development, also 9 years old, also in a single-parent family with a mother. And this is what she drew. Okay, so you can see the issue with Piaget here. And Bungie's argument is that these kinds of towers, at this time anyway, were not appropriate places for children to live. That was her community compared to the girl who lived in the single-family home with a different kind of community. So in the 1980s, I was moving to San Diego, and here are some of the issues that I think are still relevant today. The lack of children on streets in San Diego is palpable. The fear of stranger danger that one of the young people earlier on was talking about. The fear that parents have keeping their children off the streets. And then the development of places like Chuck E. Cheese, Discovery Zone, the Pirate Zone, as niches, and capitalism is very good at finding niches for making some money, but safe places, creating safe places for children, but also places for adults who have a harried life with young children to maybe relax and read the newspaper while the kids play. Although you'll notice Mum is in playing with the kids and Dad is out there reading the newspaper. That's not me. But anyway, creation of these places for children to play safely. And if you're an adult, you get stamped with your kids. Try going to one of these places without a kid. They won't let you in, So there's security and there's safety in these places. But there's also a focus on learning particular kinds of things and the technologies and the gaming. And those of you who have taken kids to places like Chuck E. Cheese, the kids know, because they're smarter than we are, they know which games give them the most tokens to redeem for the better prizes. And those are the ones. So, what are we teaching our kids here? Las Vegas, here we come. We have to be considerate about what that might be doing. And in the meantime, our outside spaces are empty. But they're not. We have our middle-class kids whose parents can afford to go to these places, occupying these niches. One of my colleagues, Cindy Katz, call them kid corrals. Right? But elsewhere, in our lower-income neighborhoods, there's lots of kids on the streets. And because they can't afford to go to those other places. They would like to, but they can't afford to. But there's also surveillance there. This is City Heights, which is one of the lowest income neighborhoods in San Diego. It's an immigrant catchment community. And right in the center of City Heights, we have San Diego Police Department. Very, very evident, right in your face. And there'll be patrols of police all the time. If you go to La Jolla, one of the upper income neighborhoods, you won't see any evidence of police departments there. And the context here is interesting. In the middle-class neighborhoods, it's about keeping the kids safe. And the surveillance here is about keeping us safe from the kids. So we get an interesting kind of context when we start looking at these in terms of class issues. Okay. So this is when I'm working. I get 1980, that's me, working in the Children's Museum in San Diego back in 1980. And we started taking some programs into the Kids Museum and working with young kids. And I think, and what Tanya's doing is really important. For many years, children's museums just worked in children's museums, but now a lot of them have a lot of outgrowth into the community. And you want to support her work and the work of the Children's Museum. We have a very good Children's Museum in San Diego now that is out in the community. And some of the programs we developed with the Kids Museum back in the 80s took what the Children's Museum was doing, the experiential kind of things, to the community. This is the Joan Kroc Homeless Center. And we took it was the very first and biggest center in San Diego that catered for families, because it was recognized in the 1980s that a lot of homeless people weren't just the men and the drunks and the people with psychiatric issues, but they were whole families. And the young people this morning talked about kids who are a context of homelessness here in Tacoma, but also in San Diego. And an important point that I want to branch off what they were talking about is that back in the 1970s and 80s, we thought homelessness was about deinstitutionalization. And these were people who were addicts and had drug problems or had mental problems. The issue now is an issue that you guys can solve. It's called social housing. It's called affordable housing. That's something that we as adults can solve. It's not a difficult problem to solve. And thankfully in San Diego, and I think also here, this is the main focus, I think, of these kinds of solutions. So anyway, we worked with the kids in the homeless shelter, and guess what? What was the most, we were asking them the same questions you were asking. What's the most important thing for them? Relations. Relations are really, really important. And we had kids create collages to contextualize the best possible place for kids to live in. Similar kind of questions that are being asked today. As you can see, slightly younger kids. We work with kids with cerebral palsy as well, and ask them about their place. Nicky here is now in his 30s, and he actually works to create a better environment for wheelchair-bound people since becoming part of the Children's Museum and working with us there. So I want to play you a video here of some work that we're doing right now in City Heights. We're continuing working with that neighborhood. So we're still working in City Heights, and this is called the Crawford Community Kaleidoscope. When we were working with the homeless kids and other kids, we had them, we used, remember those disposable cameras? You know, that was the high-tech stuff for me when I began this work. But now it's so much simpler. It's so much simpler, and it's easy to create web pages. So I want to share with you some work that was just done last year with those kids in City Heights. This is so easy to do. It doesn't take much resources at all. In fact, this took almost none. Just one of my graduate students working with me.
The purpose of this project is to expose people outside of City Heights, to expose the diversity that we have to offer, and that it's just not what people say. It's not as as bad as people would say. I guess what people have to do is expose themselves to the environment before they can have anything else to say in City Heights, and that's the great thing of City Heights, that there's a lot of diversity in City Heights that where a person can learn of a lot of different cultural backgrounds and origins, so different people.
Since people would say that it's ghetto, but I would just say it's just a low-income community. Like, there's nothing too good about it. There's nothing too bad about it.
Through interviews and photography and mapping and other media, to tell the stories of people in City Heights, about the kind of cultural diversity that there is within the neighborhood, with the voices of people who live there.
Beautiful city. Beautiful city. Alcohol Boulevard.
My favorite part of the project is getting answers, interesting answers from the person that I interviewed. You know, sometimes I don't even know, about the personal life, and how they live and how their life impacted the city.
This is part of the story mapping. It's software that's readily available from ESRI. And all the stories, and what the kids did was they went out
This American.
What do you think about City Heights? I love City Heights. It's beautiful, and every culture is here together, peace and harmony.
And this is so easy to do. It's not a difficult project to do. And it really, getting young people involved, like our leaders here. And the question I have also is, these are the kids that kind of self-selected to be leaders. What about the others? What about the others that are disaffected? We just had a horrible shooting in Florida, Nicola Cruz. What about the Nicholas Cruzes of the world? How do you get them involved? MT, the guy with the teardrop tattoo, we went into the classroom and started working with them on this. Total gangbanger. He was not going to get involved. He was way too cool. He applied to San Diego State at the end of our project and is now part at university. He had no aspirations to go to university until he got involved with this project. And it's about treating young people as they are, smart, just like us, But they have the potential to do things differently from the way that we have. And it's to enable them to do that that would be the big takeaway message I want to give you here. I'm going to move on very quickly. I've been talking for about half an hour now. I'll go for maybe another 10 minutes. Does that sound reasonable? Is that good? Okay. To talk a little bit about, to move from the US to a more kind of global scene and talk a little bit about the Child-Friendly Cities project. And my big interest right now is in child rights. So I'm going to take you to Florence, Italy, where the Innocenti program is set up in the longest running orphanage that's been going on for 600 years. And this is where the UNICEF has its Innocenti program. And the Child-Friendly Cities initiative was begun in 2000 with a clear understanding from the UN that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was set up in 1989, wasn't working. Now, just a little bit of background, we were talking about this last night. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has been the most successful rights program, bar none. And there's only one country in the world that hasn't ratified it. Yeah, us, right. South Sudan just ratified it. Somalia just ratified it a year ago. We are the last holdout in the world that hasn't ratified this particular, and there's complicated reasons for why we haven't, some good, some bad. However, like a lot of human rights projects, they come from enlightenment, they come from individualism, they come from the context of the rights being mapped on us as individuals who are women, who are men, who are disabled or whatever, who are children. And it doesn't take into account relationality that the young people were talking about earlier on. And in noting this, and I've worked with the UN as part of this, it's recognized that this kind of top-down global universal rights for all children is good because people like Amnesty International lawyers can grab that and say, you're not doing the right thing, you have to do this because the UN Convention on Universal Rights for Child demands this, that, and the next. But it gets it wrong in places. So, for example, when it talks about the ILO, the International Labour Organization, took on the UNCR and said, children need to have education and play. That's what a child's world is. But it's not. Most children in the world work. Most of them work, and most of them work from a very early age. So we should not be taking work away from children. In fact, I think white middle-class children here in the US should work more. They should be more part. They shouldn't be separated off, institutionalized in education. They should be part of the workaday world in good ways, obviously not exploitative ways. Anyway, so this initiative for the UN was saying this, and this is to you guys out here in Tacoma. This is where you do child rights. It's not up at the global level. It's not the UN level. You do it at the community level. That's where it works. And so this initiative, which is trying to take the notion of protection and provision, the 3 Ps, protection, provision, and the third one, this is the big one, which is why the CRC was better than any other human rights. It's about participation. Participation. This is a start, but it's only a start, okay? Having young people involved. And protection and provision is about making children objects of rights so that they have an opportunity for education, for health, for food, for nutrition, to provide those things for them and to protect them from harm. But participation is children as subjects in and of themselves, who have a right in and of themselves. And so we're seeing a lot of these different conferences. This is a very sensitive button. I apologize for going. And Protection and provision is about civil and political rights, and we see a push for that in Eastern Europe. Participation is perhaps more what we'd see here, and I'm going to give some examples in South America in just a minute. So I'm going to go through this very, very quickly as I come to some kind of close here. But I've been doing, as JW said, I've been doing work on child rights with several books written from around the world, looking at how child rights land in different kinds of places and how we can make that happen. In Romania, I talked about this in detail with some students yesterday who are, I see, are in the audience here. Gluttons for punishment, coming to hear me talk again. But in Romania, residential rights were taken away from a lot of Roma people who ended up out in the streets, kids out in the streets, and it's about their pushback against that. In Slovenia and Eastern Europe, we get not just rights to residence, but rights to education and rights to health, and rights to their very identity as citizens of Slovenia taken away from the erased, the izbrisani. And there was 5,600 children in Slovenia who lost their status of citizenship when Slovenia became independent and moved from communism to democracy because they were related to Serbs or Croats or whatever. And those children, those young people, protested. They took to the streets. They wrote their status in their bodies on the streets. They took the streets back. Moving to South America and economic, cultural, and political rights, you'll like this one. The Rolezinhos in Brazil, I've been working down there for a while. In December 2014, just before Christmas, young people took over the malls and they occupied them and just took them over. And they weren't shoplifting, they were dancing, they were meeting each other. This was all done on social media. They organized themselves way too quickly. One of the good things about social media, right? They organized them too quickly for the authorities to stop them. And the history of the malls goes back to Walter Benjamin in France in the 19th century, where he says it's a good thing to go for strolls, but he's talking about white middle-class people. And all of a sudden we have low-income black kids from the favela occupying upper-income malls. And is it okay? Well, they're not doing any harm. They're not breaking any laws. And so the Brazilian government had to figure out, well, what is the issue here? How do we move forward? Because their response was with a military response, with police to kick these kids out who were doing nothing wrong, except there was a lot of them. And Santiago, Chile, probably my favorite, the March of the Penguins. This was, again, this was the first social media activism on the planet. In 2006, the kids decided they wanted to take their education back. Their education under Pinochet, the dictator, had been privatized. They had lost public schools. They thought that wasn't fair. And they took to the streets. And it was called Penguins because they took to the streets in their uniforms, school uniforms, white shirts and dark blazers. Some of them even took their school desks to the streets. And so this gets people's attention because that's out of place. You don't expect to be kids sitting with their desks in the middle of the street stopping traffic. And so the adults were getting attention. And the premier of Chile at the time, it's a democratic country at this time in 2006, but the legacy of Pinochet and the privatization of the education system had continued unabated, even when Pinochet was ousted. And the kids said, it's not fair, we want it back. And the kids in the expensive private schools had solidarity with the kids from the public schools, and they all took to the streets. And via the first social media revolution on the planet, they had 80,000 kids on the streets of Santiago within a couple of weeks. Excuse me. Michelle Bachelet was the premier at that time, and she met with them, and she said, they were asking her, what will you do? She said to them, you're right, we're wrong, let's change it. How should we change it? And they said, well, first of all, we want you to take away the expense of getting into university, which they had, the privatized system had put up money, you had to pay for the examinations to get into university that used to be free. Take that away. The first year they took it away, but that's all they did. And so the kids started marching in 2007, 2008, 2009. Every single spring, at the end of the school year, they got out in the streets. Now, here's the great thing about kids protesting. They turn it into carnival. They had line dancing. They had superhuman costumes on. They were having fun. They were having fun. And initially, the government met them with tear gas and water cannons, and Michelle Bachelet, stop that. Stop that. Let them take over the streets, and let's listen to them. And then let's try and do, if we can, what they're suggesting we do. And then Michelle Bachelet got kicked out of power. She came back. She came back the next term, and she came back on a platform that involved working with the kids. And by this time, the kids had gone through university, and they were now older. She had those kids as part of her administration. And there's still a lot of problems with the education system there, but it's becoming more public, it's becoming more fair. And I wonder about our education system here, which is becoming more and more privatized. And there are good and bad things about that. I would say probably mostly bad things. I think education should be free and public. We can talk about that in the question and answer time. Let me get through this a little bit. My last context, sustainable urban places, and I'm going to be very quick with this. So, remember Melanie Klein, object relations, and how we relate to material and non-material things around us. And our young people here talked about the importance of community, the importance of compassion. Young people, and they talked about the importance of older kids holding the other end of the skipping rope. Perhaps there's a teacher on the other end. Teachers are very influential. And there's always an even younger kid waiting to jump in. And so kids have a relationship with all the environment around that, and they do good things in it. These kids are playing in a junkyard, okay, in an urban area in San Diego. These are homeless kids. And they are making it theirs, and they are not only being resilient, they're moving forward in good kinds of ways. 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza was one of the first guys, I think, to talk about sustainability, although he didn't talk about it in the ways we talk about it today. And I'm going to finish with this. I'm going to suggest that we shouldn't be thinking about the kids as our future. We shouldn't be thinking about them fixing the legacy that we have left for them. We should be thinking about it in the terms that Baruch Spinoza talked about. And he talked about it in terms of potential. Remember, I talked about potential space and relationality. And he was against the Enlightenment thinking of individuality. He says we're all relational beings. We require each other to live and to thrive. We require compassion. And he talked about conatus and potentia. Conatus is being in something fully, the way these young people are, in their lives, in their schools, and in their communities. They're fully immersed and engaged, it seems to me. They don't have to be all the time. Now, a lot of young people don't want to be they don't want to be engaged with us, but they're present. Young people are still present. And I would argue, and this is from the UN, that if we disregard the presence of any kind of group of people, that is a form of oppression. So even if they don't want to engage, we still have to accept presence. However, what happens if we create a safe space, a safe potential space for young people to become something different? And this is my final thought here. To become something different. So much of life, so much of those old academics, going back to G. Stanley Hall, are about creating children to become the same as us. Now, we haven't done that good with this planet, have we? Really. So what about if we enable children to become something different? And for us as adults, that's scary, because there's uncertainty there. We don't know what it's going to be like. They're going to surprise us. And I guarantee, if we give them the power to do that, and the Children's Museum started, if we give them the power to become something different than us, we'll be immensely surprised. And we will get a better world if we give them that power. And I want to finish with a quote from David Harvey, a friend and colleague of mine, about rights. And he says, "The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is the most precious and yet the most neglected of our human rights." So what about giving our young people the freedom to make and remake their urban spaces and thereby make and remake themselves and maybe us too? Thank you. do we have time for questions? Or I think we have the wandering microphones, if anyone's got a question. We still have a couple of young people here who probably would be better at answering the questions than I. So you guys stick around. You're going to feel my questions from me, right?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah. This is more of a comment than a question, because when you were talking about trying to shape young people into being a certain kind of adult, it was making me think about the boarding schools and how, I guess, just the history of the US and treating certain groups in a paternalistic fashion. I just made this connection, seeing how the way that we frame young people and how we're supporting young people also is how we're also treating groups, whole populations, people of color, historically. And so I just really saw that connection between how trying to force people to become a certain kind of person and really missing that opportunity for them to reach their full potential and whoever that is for themselves.
It's a good comment, and don't get me wrong. I think G. Stanley Hall and Kellogg and all those and Riis had the best of intentions, but there were adult intentions. And also, it's no coincidence that the beginning of child development as an academic discipline was at the same time as America was setting out on an imperial journey. And at the same time, and prior to that, the empires of Britain and France. And we look at what happened in Australia and up in Canada with all these boarding schools for minority children. And the imposition of an American education system, a British education system in the colonies was treating those people, those others, as if it was an infantilization of those others as well. So I don't think there's any coincidence that and nothing, those of you child development is wonderful now, but back in the day, it was about taking wild kids and programming them and making them like us, but also the rest of the world taking that and programming it and making it like America, because we thought that's what it should be like. Should the world be like America now? We've had 18 shootings this year in schools. No other country in the world has that. So we can learn. In the same way that we as adults can learn from children, we can learn from elsewhere in the world as well. Thank you for your comment.
Good morning. My name is Alyssa Rapp. I'm an architect in Seattle. And I found it interesting that your last bit about sustainability, we are used to hearing sustainability in another context now, but you were talking about a different kind of sustainability, which is almost the business case for youth engagement, or the sort of cultural business, the survival of what we care about case for youth engagement. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. A lot of we try and work with clients who are children's museums or zoos or other informal education spaces, the Park Service, things like that, to engage youth in planning for their facilities of the future. Right. And the case that we make is that if you want you have current stewards of these places who are adults, and if you want future stewards of them, then you need that engagement. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that from the urban context, about that sustainability piece.
I mean, the kind of sustainability I'm talking about is a different kind of idea. It's about the here and now. There is no future, there is no past. What do we do right now? And I mean, you heard these young people. And I think what Harvey and Spinoza would say is enable them to have their heart's desire, because their hearts are huge. And they have, I think, the ideas that can solve the problems that we're struggling with. Tanya you have this program about sharing power. I say give the power. And that's really scary. I mean, people in power don't want to give up their power. But it's happened in Scandinavian countries. In Norway, for example, they had a program where each community group of young people was given a significant amount of money for a year to do with whatever they wanted to do with it. And they didn't go buy drugs. They created festivals, right? One of you was talking about festivals. That's what they did. They did incredibly good things. So don't shortchange them. Their imaginations, their creativity. And what I heard them talking about as well was social justice. Their commitment to social justice. So you think, how many of you would be willing to give, $20,000 for a year for a youth group and don't tell them what to spend the money on it? The only thing was they had to, as a group, decide what to do. Okay? An individual couldn't take the money and buy a car or something like that. How many of you would be willing to do that? See what happens. They did it in Scandinavia with amazing results. And there's a bunch of publications I can steer you towards if you want to see what they did. We're at a time of, around the world, we're doing pretty well economically here in the US, so it seems. Some of us are. So maybe it's time to use some of that kind of money. But the rest of the world is, there are segments of the world that are still in precarious situations, and youth in particular is in very precarious situations. Youth unemployment is still much higher than unemployment as a whole, if you look at the statistics. And do we really want to have a situation where young people are pushing to go to university because we tell them it's the right thing to do, and then there's no job at the end of it? And that's happening for a lot of youth, particularly youth of color. So I agree with what you're saying about giving the power elsewhere. Yeah.
Kind of following on that topic, you spoke something that's very interesting from somebody that lives in the first world and U.S.-centric based. You talk about child labor as something that's a model. It almost sounds like a model that the U.S. should consider. And really would like to get your feedback on that, because in looking at our dissent within our schools and our kids, some of this is, I think, aligned with a lack of sense of purpose and vision and productivity. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. It's about child labor. And we've done some work through my center on child labor in Tijuana. And I went down looking for the abuse of, this was children working in markets, brand new markets in Tijuana that had just started in the 1980s, and we were working in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I went down there looking for abuse. I was looking, because these children were part of a program called the Pia de Meta program. And this was a program for the integral development of children as a whole child. And the program was run by the Social Welfare Department, and it was teaching children values, how to manage money, how to be responsible around money. They were not getting paid when they worked for the markets. They were baggers. They were, in the checkout, they were doing bagging. And so we spent a year working with these young children, and I didn't find any abuse. And I had to kind of backpedal a lot, because I was expecting, here's these nasty capitalists moving into Tijuana, abusing the kids for their free labor. And I didn't find any abuse whatsoever. But what I did find was that the young people, as young as 7, 8, and 9, and the top age was 14, and then after you're 14, you couldn't be part of this program, they responded hugely to the responsibility. There was one young man, his mother worked in the maquiladores. She was earning $65 a week, and he wasn't getting paid by the market, but he was making $80 a week in tips. He was bagging groceries, taking them out to the car, and he was making $80 a week. And it was interesting how it changes the dynamic when you have an 11-year-old making more than the parent does. And he was very responsible. And the children started organizing themselves in terms of responsibilities, in terms of teaching younger children coming in. We didn't do that. The social welfare program didn't that, but they thought that was needed. And so they started organizing themselves in very interesting and creative ways. And here, and the one thing that I noticed at the time, you would walk into these mercados, and they were very brand new and modern, well lit. And there was a sense of vitality and energy. You could hear kids singing, because they like to sing sometimes. And there was an energy that you don't get in normal supermarkets, where people are, hey, you've got more than 14 items in the quick checkout, and these kids, they created a different kind of environment. And it occurred to me how much we, in our middle-class existence, miss out in our workspace, not having kids around, not having young people around. So kids should play, yeah, but they bring their play into the workspace in very interesting ways. Just to finish, in Bolivia 2 years ago, they reduced the age of children work to 14. Yeah, so here it's 16. There they reduced it to 14, and That's totally against what the ILO are trying to do, but I think it's a good move because now, when they reduce the age now, they can go after the abusers. They can go after the people who do exploit children in a good way, and it enables younger children. And kids in Bolivia are working from a very small age anyway, so it's just a recognition that children do work. Good question, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Salome, and I'm a Sustainable Urban Development major. I just had a question with regards to sustainable development in third world countries. As you can see, they're trying to develop and they're trying to learn ways to sustainably plan for their cities. When I look at planning for a city or a space, I think of who are the actors, who are the stakeholders, which is planners, architects, investors, the government. Do you think that including the youth as a stakeholder in the planning of sustainable development in a third world country would potentially help these countries develop faster and even more sustainable and catch up with first world countries?
Oh yeah, you should put them in charge. In the global south, there are actually, I would argue, there are some good examples where they're doing that kind of thing much better than we are. And part of that does relate to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, because there's a UN committee that kind of checks how countries are involving children. And the participation, the third P in the UN Convention, is that children must be involved in any political decision making that involves children. That's required by the international law. And what the committee does is individual countries can respond back to how well they are doing. And so, unlike here in the US, you see that as a mandate. Now, I've been working in Brazil for a few years. I'm just going to be heading down there in a couple of weeks' time. And back in 2001, as part of the Constitution of Brazil, they enacted the right to the city. And the right to the city, I was talking with the students yesterday about this, it comes from a guy called Henri Lefebvre, who argued that our right as citizens of cities is the streets are ours, and that's where decisions can get made. And this was back in the 1968 in Paris, where students were taking to the streets to demand change of government. And the right to the city is a kind of a scary prospect. The right to the city is a scary prospect for some reason, the way that Lefebvre contextualizes it, because he's arguing that we've got to give up the outcomes. And he's not talking about youth per se, but he's saying give up the outcomes of planning and have the city be run in a more democratic way rather than by developers, but by people. And people have a say in that, and they have a control of the public good. Now, in Brazil, the right to the city became part of the constitution of the whole of Brazil in 2001. And part of that, and some of the work that I'm doing when I go down there in a couple of weeks, is working, or I'm actually trying to learn how we can maybe do that up here, because they have young children's and older children's panels that are part of city governance. And it's required by law, by Brazilian law. Now, one of the problems, of course, in the global south is that there is significant corruption and there are ways to subvert. And I've seen, some of my colleagues have said, it becomes tokenism, where the young people are paraded out and their voices are there, but they're not listened to. But there are other places, and Sao Paulo is one of them, where they seem to be actually affecting change, and they're embracing the child-friendly city. So in answer to your question, I think in many cases they're doing much better than we are. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Yvonne. One of the things that's resonating with me as I'm listening to your talk is the implications on community development and actually how community development is often defined, which there is a difference, particularly here in the States, because it tends to be defined through a very economic lens. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm curious to know more about is, from your experiences across cultures and other communities and how they're looking at community development, and particularly in how we going back to what you said, this recognizing that presence, and in my way, that's to really see our children. What would be some of the learnings from those communities that you would say would be useful for us here, you know, from the lens in which we're looking at community development here in the States?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not sure it's a difficult question. It's not an easy question. If there was an easy solution, I would say we need to change the economic system. You know, we're talking about, JW and I, we're talking about enlightenment. And this country is kind of based upon the context of individualism. You as an individual can make something of yourself. And elsewhere, my sense is there is more context of relations and community. How then do we move in that direction? I'm not sure the economic system we have here is sustainable. I think certainly the direction we're going right now, where we seem to have incredible economic development going on right now, but it's only showing up in the hands of a very, very small number of people. And that is extremely scary to be. And I don't think there's a sustainability, in the traditional sense of sustainability, I don't think there's a sustainability there. I think the action can happen at the community level. I think that's where change can happen. So we go from the ground up, and then maybe at some point we can affect what's going on in Washington, D.C. But I think it's difficult for Americans to unshackle themselves from the bad stuff that comes from the Enlightenment ideas of individualism. And there are good things to that, for sure, but there are some issues around that because it creates a competitiveness that does not enable the kind of compassion that we're hearing on the panel today. Okay, there's someone sitting here with a big 1, which means 1 minute to go, which I think we can maybe entertain one very quick question. They're saying, shut up, Stuart, get off the stage. Thank you so much.